Good morning, junior class. We are doing one last section of chapter 23 today. I am doing no camera today because the storm last night knocked out my septic system temporarily, and I have not yet had a shower today. So I'm saving you from that view. Okay, so we need to finish up the end of this chapter. We're going to have a test on Wednesday. The review will open up tomorrow or tonight if I can get it up there fast enough, but I'm not sure about that. Okay, so we're going to talk about life in post-war America. As I said, we've already started this section, so this first part at least should be a little bit of a review, and I'm going to talk fast. As America's coming out of World War II, we see this unprecedented economic prosperity. Everything's going great. People are recovering from the Depression. They are getting back to work. We have little competition in the world as an industrial supplier, so we are supplying the world with all kinds of things. Remember too that this is the era when credit cards started becoming an issue. That was something that the average American could have, and we talked on Thursday or Friday about the idea of planned obsolescence as well. The idea that a refrigerator wasn't supposed to last forever, that it would last long enough to get you to the next latest and greatest model. Now, obviously, a refrigerator is a bigger purchase, but something like a blender or small appliances, those kind of things, they were no longer designed to last a lifetime. Okay, we also saw the baby boom at this time. My parents are the result of the baby boom. Mine were born in 1945, right as the war was ending. But the baby boom are those born between 1945 and 1960. Just, massive birth rate, lots of couples getting married, lots of wonderful things really for the family, because the television even celebrated the American middle class family, made it look like there was an ideal. And I don't know if any of you have ever seen the shows that were talked about in the textbook, but some of those are some of my favorites to watch as reruns. I didn't see them as originals. I'm not that old, but I Love Lucy, Father Knows Best, Leave It to Beaver, Ozzie and Harriet is one that I have not watched. The Honeymooners I haven't watched either. Anyway, great shows. Television was making its debut at that point too. We also talked about women had now gone to work, although women as a queen of domesticity, this idea is that the role of the housewife was elevated. It was supposed to be the best thing ever to just be able to be a housewife and take care of your family. But this is also an era when many women were working outside the home for the first time. They had gone to work during the war and they continued to work. And we're also seeing the number of single parent heads of household rise dramatically, because as the marriage rate went up, so did the divorce rate. So we're seeing more women as a single parent, or men as single parents in the country. Okay, civil rights. Let's talk about that for just a little bit. It's a basic right that is guaranteed because of your citizenship. Because you are a citizen of the United States, you have certain inalienable rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And next year, as we get into government, we will talk about that more. And it will be interesting to see what civil rights cases come up before our Supreme Court next year as a result of the stay-at-home orders that we're seeing now. I really do believe that this is going to turn into a constitutional civil rights issue as we come out of this crisis. But in this era at least, we're going to see the emergence of minority rights, as they should have been at the outset of the Civil War. Coming out of that, it should have been just the black populations was given their citizenship. They should have at that point had full civil rights, but we all know that didn't happen. So how did they fight for those civil rights? And here we go. Okay. So this is going to our civil rights movement here is going to refer primarily to attempts by Black Americans to secure and exercise protection of their basic civil rights. And we all know that discrimination occurred on a widespread basis. And how are we going to get rid of this for good? One of the things that your book does mention on page 544 is the sports hero Jackie Robinson. Of course, he is famous for breaking the color barrier in Major League Baseball. An incredible testimony this man had. Here he was a war hero and comes back to play baseball, and he is ridiculed and harassed from the stands in almost every park he goes to. And yet he took it. He absorbed that instead of lashing out at others. He was just an incredible human being to have taken as much as he did. Okay. And that's what it took to break that color barrier. And because of him, now thousands are able to play professional sports and are accepted. And it just took somebody who was willing to take that first step, and he was a good example for that. All right, so President Truman is going to be the first one to really give attention to the issue of civil rights. Under his administration, we see the court case of Brown versus the Board of Education. This is a little girl named Linda Brown who is not allowed to go to the school that is closest to her because it is an all-white school. So they took the case to all the way to the Supreme Court, and it was determined in the case of Brown versus the Board of Education that separate educational facilities were considered inherently unequal. Therefore, you cannot purposefully separate schools into black schools and white schools. This overturned the decision of Plessy versus Ferguson from 1896 and segregated all public schools. Many Southern schools resisted, especially in places like Little Rock, Arkansas, where the governor, who was Mr. Faubus, had to use the Arkansas National Guard to block students from coming in. So federal troops had to be sent in to stop him from doing that. Never should have happened in America. And then, of course, we had the Montgomery bus boycott when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white man who got on the bus after her. So she was arrested. Black citizens boycotted the city bus system for months. And it was as a result of the Montgomery bus boycott that Martin Luther King Jr. emerged as a leader of the civil rights movement, promoting civil disobedience in peace. He helped to found an organization called the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. This organization still exists, but is really rather more radical today. The SCLC, as its founding, encouraged nonviolent marches and protests. Martin Luther King Jr. appealed to many middle-class white citizens, encouraging them to help with the civil rights movement. He also encouraged sit-ins at restaurants and lunch counters where blacks had previously not been allowed to sit, to just go in and sit and just peacefully demand their rights. We also had freedom riders, of course, at this time. Those who would take the bus, traveled in buses across the Deep South in 1961 to challenge segregated buses and terminals. James Meredith was the first black student to enroll at the University of Mississippi. He required federal troops to escort him to class. Television tended to show the violence that was used against protesters, and this scared protesters and kept them from peacefully demonstrating. So eventually we had the March on Washington. This was in October of 1963. Organizers of the March on Washington were careful to ensure that the demonstration would be peaceful and demonstrate the peaceful intentions of most African Americans in securing their civil rights. The march was one day. It was not going to go over. It was not going to be a long-term thing. It was not going to create a bunch of havoc in Washington, D.C. The leadership agreed to a government order for liquor stores to be closed for the day so that there would be no drunkenness in the street. The vast majority of those who attended were Black, but there were efforts made to include the white population as well. So there were whites who were there. And of course, the biggest thing about the March on Washington was it was the day of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech that we still remember and we still quote. This is my favorite quote. I didn't put this in here, but this is my favorite quote from that speech. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And isn't that what we all want for America? If that's not what you want, then maybe you need to rethink that part of what you want for America. We all want to be judged by our character, by who we are, not by the color of our skin. Okay. That is not the end of our discussion of civil rights in America. We will come back to this in future chapters. But for right now, we need to just finish up chapter 23. There were some changes in religion as a result of World War II. There was a renewed interest. More people returned to church. The words "under God" were added to our Pledge of Allegiance in 1956, 55, 56, somewhere there. And "In God We Trust" was added to all of our currency. It had been on and had been taken off, and then it came back. Teddy Roosevelt is the one who had removed it, and then it came back in the 1950s and became the true national motto. We also see the growth of what is called the ecumenical movement. The ecumenical movement was popular in the post-war era. It was basically an era of understanding and cooperation between churches. The idea that we needed to form a single church instead of denominations. This was promoted by the National Council of Churches and the World Council of Churches, wanting to get to the point that there was no difference between churches, that they were all the same. But that's just not possible because, for most of us, we don't agree with every church in existence. Conservative Christian groups also grew, led by men like Charles Fuller and Billy Graham, who is pictured here. And also we see the growth of the movement called Youth for Christ. And that is the end of the chapter. Okay? So, take your quiz and look for your review materials coming soon.